Stop walking off the ledge. No, stop turning around. Stop! Work! Do as I command. I am man. You are machine. Do as you're told or I will pull your plug. Oh, I didn't see you there. Welcome back, my curious little guppies. If you've seen the thumbnail or read the title, you know what time it is. I have indeed managed to produce another episode for you guys, and it only took me 2 months this time, a new episode of my new game devlog, all about a little rover's adventures on Mars. And to make up for my slowness, I have a pretty big episode for you today, covering the meat and potatoes of this game's gameplay loop, and that is of course, the enemies. Today's episode will cover the origins of our catalog of enemies and the early steps of combat against them. If you haven't seen the previous episodes, I've linked the new playlist in the top right play card for your convenience. Either way, I'll give you a quick summary of our last episode since we're building directly from that. Last episode, we covered the user interface, the heads-up display, the health and energy variables, created items to regenerate lost resources, and I created a devilish hazard that damages players on direct contact. Our players now have health to watch and, more interestingly, an energy bar that depletes as they progress through the levels. Players have 2 ways to die and 2 ways to prevent it. The screws heal players and the spare batteries provide extra energy. But if you play the game right now, it's still missing something, or at least I think so. At least with my spike bots and resource management, players actually face the risk of losing as they try to go from point A to point B, but I really think the next thing this game needs is a bit more risk and reward. Games are actually all about risk and reward. Every decision asks a question. Is it worth it? It's the moment when players have to weigh the risks and reward of any action. One of the simplest examples would be the moment the player attempts to defeat an enemy. When you approach an enemy, there's a risk that you'll mess up and take damage. However, if you defeat the enemy, the reward is the enemy's destruction. This can apply to a multitude of situations, such as debating whether to go for a treasure chest surrounded by spikes or whether now is the right time to strike the boss. It's honestly one of the most fundamental aspects of any gaming experience, and one that often happens without much thought put into it, because it's so insanely natural. That's why last month was essentially all about designing my tasty and deadly enemies, creating the risks and later the rewards. Writing the code for the enemies presented a unique challenge. How exactly should my enemies behave in order to bring a reasonable amount of risk to a proportionate amount of reward? In any video game, enemies are often the most memorable and identifiable aspects of the experience. When you think of a game like Mario, it's hard not to immediately think of stomping Koopas in the original Super Mario Bros. That means we need to make something memorable, easy, and most importantly, effective in the environment we created. So I got to work on designing my first enemy. Many days were spent putting boxes together in certain shapes, hoping that something will come out. I actually found out how all the hotkeys work in Sprite, which is kind of amazing that I've gotten this far without knowing those. But either way, after a lot of trial and error, I have created something. I call him the Muncher Bot. First, let's talk about his design. Technically, I did this after I wrote the code, but for my visual medium, it makes sense to show him before I show what he does. When I first thought about designing enemies, I had a very different idea for this game. My Weekend on Mars was mostly a resource management game with dig-dug controls, and my idea for enemies was to make them terrifying Martian monsters. I figured out very quickly though that I wanted to make this game a bit more cutesy in its art direction and overall vibe. While the idea of having a cute character tear through horrifying monsters sounded like a fun idea, I think it betrayed the potential of making a widely appealing game. I also dialed it back because it invoked a terrifying image of my rover drenched in alien guts. Maybe it was best that I make the enemies robots, huh? Muncher Bots are these cube-shaped creatures, much like the rover. They sit at roughly the same height, only a smidge taller, making them slightly imposing. Like the Spike Bot, Munchers only have one eye. I thought keeping that consistent would be a fun way to visually indicate that these bots are related. You can see that they have jaws they use to munch with razor-sharp teeth, hence the name. Those do look pretty painful. They have 4 little feet that they use to walk back and forth, and while that may seem to give them an advantage over the rover, I always figured these guys were a little clumsy. They can't wall jump, they can barely jump at all really, and their stubby little legs seem more like an unfortunate design flaw, despite looking genius on paper. Now let's talk about their behavior. Muncher Bots are this game's equivalent of Goombas or Waddle Dees, the most basic enemy in the game. Or at least the most basic enemy with legs, sorry about that. I knew that Munchers couldn't be overly complex, so initially I thought of making it as simple as him dealing damage if the player bumps into him. The only difference between a Muncher and a Spiker is that Munchers move, making them more unpredictable. But they were a little hard to implement than I expected because I immediately got errors. Lately people have been asking me how I stay motivated. My main advice for game development, or really any skill, is to learn to be okay with mistakes. It's all part of the process. Like I got this funny glitch where the Muncher just spins around when he hits a wall forever. Like literally there's no way out for him. He just lives here now. He also kept walking backwards wherever he went. It was something I did wrong with the flip H in the code. These bugs are definitive proof that I usually get to where I want after numerous failed attempts. If anyone thinks I'm a good game developer, then look at this guy. I'm literally wearing this dude as a hat. He cannot kill me no matter how much he tries. Last month especially, I hit a few walls. And I realized something else while I bore witness to my mistakes. These guys are really freaking dumb. Because as it turns out, Goombas are not exactly what we're looking for in a game where players can dig around the levels. Mario never had the ability to essentially go through tiles, so I figured out very quickly that an enemy that just walks back and forth wasn't really ideal. Does this mean I have to give him a lot of new abilities to make him dangerous? I considered letting him break tiles, spit projectiles, or jump around, but I decided to restrain myself. If the first enemy that players saw could do all kinds of crazy tricks, it would be tough for newcomers to get invested, and frankly make every combat encounter a little too intense. So I opted for something else. Instead of making new abilities, I would just make my munchers a tad bit smarter. But also because if I make them too smart, I might have an uprising on my hand. Instead, I opted for a simpler yet refined approach to coding called state machines. A state machine is code logic that lets enemies respond to specific conditions. It essentially asks, when something happens, what behavior should the entity exhibit? If I am hungry, then I destroy my living room in pursuit of Dorito chips that are missing from between my furniture. Though I likely wouldn't be very successful, so maybe I need to think smarter and not harder when it comes to designing my enemies. In my case, I didn't need anything too complex, just a couple of different behaviors to make sure my munches weren't constantly running off edges and were able to put up a real fight against players. That makes them deadly, but not so deadly they'll have to worry about unleashing Skynet. The munchers have 3 primary behaviors that they will cycle through based on the situation. These behaviors are idle, chase, and search. I gave my munchers eyesight, and their behavior depends directly on whether or not they can see the player. If you observe a muncher when they are not in sniffing range of a player, you'll find them wandering around somewhat bored. I took this opportunity to give these guys a bit of personality without overwhelming myself with work distractions right away. Munchers will walk back and forth a bit aimlessly, and they take pauses to sort of just chill out. Honestly, munchers seem like pretty chill guys when they're not actively trying to murder you. Their days seem to be spent pacing back and forth, thinking. I'm not sure what they're thinking about, but they are thinking. I plan on giving them more fleshed out animations later, but as you can see, they can blink. I think I'll have their eyes wander, I might make them yawn, and overall just make it seem like they're spaced out, maybe biting the air and taking naps. No promises just yet, but I'm just thinking out loud, and I'm thinking that maybe we can give them a lot of behavior in their idle state. But all of this changes as soon as you enter their lives. If a muncher spots a player, they'll begin to chase the player down, rushing towards them as fast as their stubby little legs can carry them. If the player makes contact with a muncher, that's an ouch, and they lose 1 health point, just like with the spikers. This stage is called the chase state. Munchers are smart enough to turn around if you attempt to jump over them, able to track the player no matter what maneuver they may attempt. Their range of eyesight is about 5 blocks and they can't see through tiles. This means players can sometimes avoid confronting them altogether because they will not chase what they cannot see. That being said, when do they stop? Well, if a player leaves their line of sight or manages to hide behind a tile, the muncher will lose them. This is where they begin the search state. The search state is an in-between state between chase and idle, where munchers will pace back and forth to locate the player. In this state, the muncher no longer is tracking the player as effectively as they were before. They seem kinda confused about where the player went. This state only lasts a couple of seconds and has one of 2 possible conclusions. If the muncher finds the player again, they return to the chase state and track them down. However, if the player stays out of sight until the search is over, the muncher will revert back to idle. Honestly, I think the muncher would be a lot deadlier if they had prescription glasses. If you think about it, they have the same problem as stormtroopers, so I must be doing something right about designing my underlings. As you can see from these demonstrations, the munchers are an active threat to the player that will try to defend certain regions, making navigation a little trickier, but they are in no way undefeatable. Even before I made combat, these guys are pretty easy to avoid if need be, and that's mainly on purpose. Munchers play defense, keeping players away from spare batteries and other rewards I plan to make on the future. With all that said, we have a pretty good groundwork for an enemy who's out for blood with an endless hunger for rover flesh, regardless of whether or not they could pass the SAT or not. However, our player really has no way to defend themselves. Running away is always an option, of course, but our rover is no coward and neither are my players. That means we need to begin work on combat. How will players defeat their enemies? This is a big question. What exactly is this game's gameplay loop? Kirby eats enemies, Mario stomps on heads, Solid Snake shoots gun. Our rover, well, he uses his drill. I mean, honestly, what else would he do? A body slam? Actually, that would be kinda sick. Now I kinda wanna see these guys in the boxing ring. When the player spots an enemy, they'll have a moment to consider whether to engage or run away. Engaging the enemy will begin what I like to call a drill clash. The rover uses its drill to strike the enemy, and the player has a moment to mash the button to destroy it. This clash moment is essentially a quicktime event with a win state and a lose state. If an enemy is within range and the player hits the drill button, the rover and that enemy will be locked into a drill clash. It's the player's job to mash the button quickly, and this tension bar shows how the clash is going. When you hit the button, the bar goes up, and when you aren't hitting it, it goes down. Fast. When the bars fill up all the way, the enemy is destroyed and the player is victorious. If the bar goes all the way down, the enemy wins the clash and the player is damaged and knocked back. The mechanics shouldn't be especially complicated, and for players who are more familiar with the game, it'll become second nature. Depending on the enemy, this tense moment might be easier or harder, with Munchers offering a very easy, forgiving window to perform drill clashes. You'll notice that the sprites shake and the tension bar pulses. These are things I added later to give the moment a bit more oomph. This is not how it looks by default, so I had to make them wiggle and dance to show that they're in a desperate battle for survival. I also made these sprites of the Munchers being shocked, with cracks forming at its center. In the future, I'm gonna make the crack grow based on how the clash is going, and I want to give them an animation for when they hit the player, munching down to deliver their wrath. A lot of that stuff is polish and fluff for later. What matters for today is getting the fundamentals down, and I think we're getting there. Speaking of fundamentals, while the combat should work fine enough, I wanted to take better advantage of the player's moveset to make alternative means for defeating enemies. This isn't too complicated an idea, but I thought it might be fun if I gave them fall damage. Players can take full advantage of the fact that Munchers are not built to survive falls from heights over 4 blocks. Munchers are not especially clever, so you can easily lead them into a trap by digging a little hole, and by making that hole log into 4 blocks, you've essentially made a death trap for Munchers. These guys, aren't the brightest. And while they can avoid ledges while they're idle, they lose all 2 of their brain cells when they're chasing the player down. They aren't them when they're hungry. There is another important element I think is necessary: rewarding players for defeating enemies. You'll remember the rover has a battery bar that is constantly draining, and while I can definitely leave a lot of these spare batteries lying around to help players, I think my enemies can do some of the heavy lifting too. Enemies have a 45% chance of dropping a spare battery and a 15% chance of dropping a health screw. This is the reward aspect of risk and reward. You aren't just killing enemies to get rid of them, there's a little treat if you perform the clash correctly and take out enemies. It might not always be a good idea to go for a snack when you aren't certain that you'll get a drop, but a little treat for going through all the trouble would be a good enough reason to motivate players to fight enemies, and also look forward to the potential outcomes. Now that I think about it, these spare batteries and screws that drop from enemies must be part of their construction, and the rover gets these resources by destroying enemies. Have I accidentally turned the rover into a robot vampire? Maybe. But he's too cute to be judged, and they probably were asking for it. Can't we let that slide in a court of law? Your Honor, he made it look adorable though. Now that we have our Munchers in working order and 2 methods of defeating them, it's time to make things a little trickier for the players. A single Muncher is very little threat to players who are paying attention. The only real potential challenge that Munchers can pose is when there's more than one and they work together to interrupt your drill clash. Yeah, they can interrupt you if you take too long to account for other enemies, but these are still a bottom line basic enemy. That's why I designed another guy to add to our roster of deadly foes. I present to you the Spring Bot. Spring Bots, or Springers, are based on jackhammers, or more accurately, pogo sticks. Like the Munchers and Spikers, Springers have only one eye. They're designed a lot simpler than Munchers, simply being a pogo stick with an eye, but for this concept I don't think I really needed anything too complex. Springers operate very similar compared to Munchers, sitting idle when there are no players around and then charging at the players when they are spotted. But charging isn't the right word. Springers prefer to, spring into the air and land on the player to deliver punishment. I made a jumping enemy. Springers are all about timing, waiting for the right moment for them to recover from a jump attack so you can deliver a whole world of pain. But somehow this was way harder to do than the Munchers. I kid you not, I spent about an hour sitting here with a Spring Bot that refused to move no matter what I did with the code. I triple checked everything and essentially it just sat there, hurting me only if I ran directly into it, and emotionally wounding me. Some advice for aspiring game developers to learn from my mistakes: the print function is extremely useful in finding problems. You can plaster it in any part of your code to test to see where your logic may be flawed. Paste it under any function, any if-then statement, and you can usually find parts of the code that are being ignored or falling flat. In my case, however, even that wasn't enough because I could not, for the life of me, get any new inputs no matter where I put them. That's when I found my issue. I made the script before I named the node, and I don't remember when or how, but I seemingly duplicated the script to keep things organized and never reattached it to the new script. No matter how often I made changes, the node wasn't reading my script because it was reading the old script. Again, stupid mistakes. This one had me banging my head against the desk, unable to comprehend why literally nothing was working. Always remember what I said in episode 1. Stay organized or stuff like this happens. Spring bots are a bit more unpredictable than munchers, making players wait a second and strategize on the best way to defeat them. They aren't especially hard to beat, but coupled with some munchers and they work pretty well together. Simply climbing a couple of blocks is not going to be enough to escape their watchful eye, as their improved vision lets them chase you longer and reach you from the high ground. But we all know how that ends. In case you guys haven't pieced it together, spring bots are also immune to fall damage. What works on one enemy doesn't always work on others. I do have some ideas for future methods of defeating spring bots, like making them land on a hazard, but I'll have to wait for the next episode. I might expand on the combat system later, as this is a very simple, cut and dry difficulty curve, but at the same time, simplicity is what we're going for here. Instead of trying to make this like the next Dark Souls, we'll try to keep things around where they are now. Especially because combat in this game is more about strategy than complex mechanics. Though honestly, I've been thinking about expanding the Rover's moveset for a while now. Though again, that may need to wait for another episode. For now, I made a couple of sprites to show the different muncher behaviors and provide some visual feedback when destroying a muncher. Now this may seem like a small feat when compared to the numerous features I made for the last episode, but this is actually huge for the rest of the game. Instead of making combat more complex, my next step was going to be making enemies a bit more diverse. After all, these two are just our beginner enemies, with spring bots adding a new flavor, but I'm looking to make the enemy roster a whole ice cream shop worth of flavors. Aside from giving the Rover some new moves, I was also thinking of using the environment to spice up combat, and I'll do that in the next episode, which is all about environments, level design, and putting a lot of these groundwork ideas to the test. And if you couldn't have guessed already, that's all I have for this month. Thank you for watching. I can't thank you guys enough for the massive support. As I'm writing this video, I'm literally 1 subscriber away from 2K, which means a lot to me, especially since I stopped making videos for so long. Leave a like if you want to see all these little bots fully animated and seen the full game. Dislike the video if you're uncool and need to stop hating. Consider leaving comments. I want to see if any of you have any ideas for some fun animations for the enemies. What kind of drink does the muncher take? Does he take his coffee hot or iced? I gotta know. And please consider subscribing for the price of nothing. Your support will take this rover to see the stars. Maybe even show a friend by sharing the video. This has been my 4th devlog for my weekend on Mars. I hope you enjoyed. So like I always say, stay hydrated, avoid blue water, it's got sharks in it, and I'll see you guys next time.